everyone, let's get some books for your TBR. Now, the way that I came up with this list is I am just about to start Charlotte Gray by Sebastian Faulks, and this is a World War II historical fiction novel. And I see all over booktube, lists about what are the best historical fiction books not about World War II, because if you like historical fiction like me, you probably know that there are a ton of historical fiction books written about World War II. So I started this one and I thought to myself, why don't I just embrace it? Why don't I make a list of books about World War II, historical fiction books about World War II that were great, that I really loved. So that's what this list is. Because sometimes you just gotta embrace it. But what I did try to do with this list is I tried to focus not just on, France and Germany and Great Britain. I feel like most historical fiction books, or I shouldn't say that, but there are a ton that tend to focus on France, England, and Germany. Now, of course, considering that the genre that I'm talking about, I am gonna have books that are about, France, Germany, and Great Britain. But I am going to try to pepper in some in there about World War II and what was happening in other parts of the world. And then just one caveat before we continue, I definitely would not recommend reading many of these books just one after another after another. As you might imagine, World War II can be pretty heavy. I actually just finished a World War II book and there were parts of it where I was like, ugh. I mean, it was just so sad that I feel like if you read too many of these books in a row, it's just very depressing and you sort of wonder about humans as a general species. So that's just one little caveat. Of course, these books that I have, they definitely have a tone of hope because for me personally, I don't like reading books that have no hope. So there may be some books that you think should be on the list and I chose not to put them on the list because to me, they didn't have hope. Or maybe I just haven't read them. So feel free also as well to comment below what are some great historical fiction books about World War II. But let's get on with the list. Let's start with The Power of One by Bryce Courtney. So this one is actually about South Africa and it begins in South Africa around the time of when World War II is just starting. Obviously, it deals with World War II, that is the historical period, but obviously I would say mostly it deals with apartheid. This is a fantastic novel. It's about a boy, PK, and basically just, what he endures. And ultimately, it's about the power of the human spirit. This actually is one of my favorite books of all time. If you've never read it, I highly recommend it. Now, next, let's go with an easy one. This is one that I see on so many lists, and that is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Now, before, you comment and say that you don't like Kristen Hanna, because I know there's definitely a large group of people that absolutely love Kristen Hanna, and then a large group of people that don't like Kristen Hanna, I will say that The Nightingale is very much unlike any of her other books. I've read a lot of Kristen Hanna books. I'd say, she's kind of hit and miss for me, but I'd say typically her books are just huge, big soap operas. I kind of equate them to a novel that Michael Bay would create, but then you add in some, lifetime trashiness to it. That's kind of her typical novel. The Nightingale is not that at all, but it does deal with France. I mean, it's about two French women in World War II and sort of the ways in which they both resist the Nazis that are occupying France. Now let's go to a different part of the world during World War II, and that is, and I'm going to give you two books here because they randomly both deal with the same situation in World War II, and this is what was happening in the Pacific Northwest in the United States to the Japanese population during World War II. So there were internment camps in the United States of Japanese Americans during World War II, and both of these books, that is Snow Falling on Cedars and Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, they both deal with that historical fact during World War II. I loved both of these books. This one, Snow Falling on Cedar, is also a murder mystery as well. This one is more of a love story, I would say, although this one has a story of unrequited love in it as well. But both were excellent. But anyways, very, very great books, and it's a part of history that I don't feel like really gets highlighted that much. Another great World War II book is Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. Now this deals with Denmark, with Copenhagen during World War II, and it deals with the plight of the Jewish population at this time. This is a YA novel, but one that I highly recommend. Now the next one is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Dewar. You may wonder, this is actually my Spanish copy of the book because sometimes I like to read books that I've already read in English in Spanish just to help me with my Spanish. But this is a fantastic World War II novel. It is a very quiet novel. It's very beautifully written, but it is essentially written about a French girl and a German boy and their experiences during the war. As you might imagine, the German boy, he gets swept away into what is happening with the Nazis. He's an extremely intelligent orphan, and the Nazis basically take him and they want to use him because he's really good with radios. And then the French girl, she is actually a blind girl. She's from Paris. Her dad is the person who's in charge of all of the keys at the Natural History Museum in Paris. This book also deals with a priceless stone that is being hidden by the French museum that the French girl's father works for. But anyways, this is a very quiet novel, but I feel like it is ultimately it's about the kindness that people can show to one another despite the great harm that may befall them because of it. Now, these next two are by the same author. They are Beneath a Scarlet Sky and The Last Green Valley by Mark Sullivan. So these are books. They are historical fiction, but they are based on real events, and the reason why he chose to write these books as historical fiction is because he didn't have enough documents to make it a book of narrative nonfiction. So I actually just finished The Last Green Valley. This was very good, and it was about a part of World War II history that not many people really know about. It's about a population of Germans, so ethnic Germans that lived in Ukraine at the time of World War II, and they were basically given the choice to repatriate to Germany from Ukraine, so they kind of have to make the decision, what is worse, Stalin or Hitler? I don't really want to tell you more than that because it might ruin the story a little bit for you, but I highly recommend The Last Green Valley. And at first, I thought it started off a little bit, sometimes with historical fiction novels, ones that I don't particularly like, it's sort of just, and then this happened, and then this happened, but there's no narrative tension, there's really no narrative arc. At first, when I started reading this book, I thought it was going to be like that, but it actually wasn't. It really got to a beautifully wrought narrative arc after that. But I will say parts of this book were super, super heavy. And I also will say that it was a little bit heavy-handed, I would say, because the author really wanted to try to prove a point that, God is all around us. And he also wanted to it felt like teach you how to manifest, like you were reading a modern book about manifesting, which, I've read plenty of those books. And I say this as someone who has a strong belief in God. That's just kind of how I am. That's what I believe. But even for someone like me, I thought it was a little bit heavy-handed. But that was the only real critique I had of that book. I thought it was excellent. And then Beneath a Scarlet Sky, this is about Italy during World War II, and there actually isn't much about Italy that is in the form of historical documents in terms of what happened in World War II, because a lot of it was burned right after the end of World War II, because many people in Italy were ashamed of having been on the side of the Nazis, so a lot of what happened was just destroyed. So that was why Mark Sullivan, even though he wanted to write the story initially as a narrative nonfiction story, he had to write it as historical fiction. But it is about a young man in Italy who decides to work as a spy against the Nazis. And it also has to do with the Catholic Church and how they helped Jewish people escape from wherever they were into parts of Europe where they would be safe, for example, Switzerland. In this book, the main character gets involved with that because they live in the Italian Alps, and so how they help people get across the Alps into Switzerland. Now, Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is another really good World War II book, although it does deal beyond World War II. It actually starts in World War I and goes beyond into, I think, maybe like the 1990s, but a good chunk of it deals with World War II, and it specifically deals with what happened to the Korean population in Korea and Japan and the relationship between the Japanese. I really enjoyed this book because it was about a part of history that I really knew nothing about. I was really fascinated by it, but I will say that, one criticism of the book is that the characters were a little bit shallow. They didn't have the depth that maybe you'd find in some other books. I would agree with that. I do think that there was a bit of a lack of depth in terms of the characters, but I think part of that was because it dealt with just a particular family and their experiences over this long, basically 100-year period. So maybe that was why it lacked a little bit of depth in terms of the characters, but I do highly recommend the book. I really enjoyed it. Now, if you are a Ken Follett fan, you probably know that he's got a lot of really good World War II thrillers, as well as his Century Trilogy book, which deals with one book is World War I, one book is World World War II, and then one book is sort of, you know, the Cold War era in the world. So the World War II book, Winter of the World, you don't have to necessarily read the World War I book to understand the World War II book, because kind of what he does in these books is he'll deal with one cast of characters and then it's their children in the next book, and then it's their children in the next book. So you don't necessarily have to know what happened with the parents, although I do highly recommend the World War I book. But since we're talking about World War II, Winter of the World is your typical Ken Follett page turner, but also what's really interesting about it is he does a really good job of explaining lots of parts of the history of World War II that you may not be aware of. He deals with a cast of characters with every major arena of the war in Europe, so he doesn't deal with Asia at all, but he does deal with, you know, he has a German character, he has a British character, he's got a Russian character, he's got an American, you know, you always gotta have an American in there, and I always find it interesting how Americans are portrayed in books, because it's just funny to me how people perceive them, given that I'm American. And I think those are the main characters that he has in there. But he deals with the whole war in Europe, and he does it in a very fast and page-turner way. He also has several spy novels dealing with World War II, and as you might imagine, because it's your typical, you know, pulp fiction novel, which I still highly recommend. It's very page-turnery. I mean, if you're looking for a lot of fun, you might want to try Eye of the Needle or Jackdaws. He also has Key to Rebecca, which deals with Egypt in World War II. It's a spy novel as well. That one wasn't like my favorite Ken Follett spy novel, but it was still good nonetheless. So there's just some options for you there. Another World War II novel that I highly recommend is Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Septis. So this one actually deals with the Lithuanian perspective of World War II, which I've never, you know, read about at all until I read this book. I will say that this book is very, very heavy. It's about a family that is basically taken away and put into a Soviet prison of war camp. And it's just, I mean, most of the novel I would say is very bleak, because obviously there's no way that this family can escape. I mean, I'm not giving away any spoilers here because we all know what happened in these prisoner of war camps. I will say that it does end with hope, but it is heavy, very heavy. And now last on this list is The Things We Cannot Say by Kelly Rimmer. So this is basically about a young woman who is in Poland during World War II. So it's dealing with the Polish perspective of what was happening in World War II. I will say that this book surprised me because I thought that it was going to be similar to some other World War II books that I've read that I didn't like, where they sort of force this thing where they're going back and forth between timelines, which to me, I feel like kind of takes away from the narrative tension, because a lot of what you're reading about in the past, you already know happens because you have these dual timelines. For example, Codename Helene, that I felt like was the reason why I didn't like that book, is because everything that I was reading about, I already knew happened. There was no narrative tension, which is why I did not like that book. And The Things We Cannot Say, I thought it was going to fall into that trap. I feel like that this was a very popular way to write books when these books were written, but it surprised me. So that was a good book to read if you are interested in getting your World War II historical fiction fix. So I hope you've got some books for your TBR, and let me know in the comments down below, what books do you love that are World War II historical fiction? So I hope you've got some books for your TBR, and as always, happy reading.